Hey, hello everyone. Welcome back to Spanish with Professor Jason. It's been a while. This video lesson is the first in a two-part series on gendered language forms in Spanish and some of the emerging alternatives to those forms. What I hope to do in this lesson is to provide an introduction to the topic that'll be useful for language teachers, language learners, translators, and interpreters, but also to anyone else who might be interested in this somewhat controversial topic that seems to be gaining more and more visibility on social media, but also gaining traction out in the real world beyond our screens. But before we dive into the content, I just want to make clear that my purpose here today is strictly to describe what's happening and why. Of course, I do have my own views and opinions on many topics, but I'm not here today to tell you what you should think about gender identity, and much less how to speak or write Spanish. All right, with that intro out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, as usual, let's start the lesson off with a content overview. Just so you know what to expect, here's a look at the content for both parts of the series. In part 1, we'll define some key concepts and terms, discuss some issues relating to gender and language, consider examples of gendered language uses and forms in English and Spanish, discuss why this topic is an important one right now, and finally, I'll share my thoughts on grammatical gender and gender-neutral language at the end of the video, sort of like a mini soapbox moment. Looking ahead to part 2, the second video lesson, we'll review the idea of grammatical gender in a bit more detail. We'll review classes of words in Spanish that exhibit binary gender with an emphasis or deep dive, if you will, on nouns. Sort of the idea that in order to break the rules or to innovate with the language, we need to thoroughly understand the rules. From there, we'll learn alternatives to uses and forms that some consider to be male-centric or even sexist. We'll also talk about alternatives meant to be more inclusive of non-binary folks. I'll discuss some in real-life context where gender-neutral language matters. And finally, soapbox moment number 2, I'll share some personal thoughts about assuming the worst, policing language, and educating others. Before we dive into the content, please don't forget or please remember to subscribe to my channel and to like, comment on, and please share this video to help get the word out about my channel, Professor Jason Spanish and Portuguese. All right, let's get started by going over some basic definitions that are pertinent to these topics. And just a quick disclaimer first. These are some of the best definitions I could find from very trustworthy sources on the internet. Now, they may not be perfect, and there are others, but for our purposes today, these will work just fine. And by the way, and this is a theme I'll come back to again and again, if you like to play the role of language police, this might not be the video for you. Let's start by talking about gender as a grammatical category. This refers to a system of classifying nouns into 2 or sometimes 3 classes, masculine and feminine, sometimes neuter, that governs their agreement with related forms, such as determiners, adjectives, and pronouns. Gender categorization of nouns may reflect real-world qualities, such as biological sex, but it may also be somewhat arbitrary. Next category or next term, gender as a social construct. So this refers to the socially constructed characteristics of women and men, such as norms, roles, and relationships of and between groups of women and men. It varies from society to society and can be changed. That's according to the World Health Organization. How about the idea or the concept of gender identity? Gender identity. Well, this refers to one's innermost concept of self as male, female, a blend of both, or neither. How individuals perceive themselves and what they call themselves, gender identity. What about when you hear about binary gender or the gender binary? This refers to a system in which gender is constructed into 2 strict categories of male or female, wherein everyone is assumed to be one or the other, kind of like Spanish grammar if we apply it to language. The term cisgender is another one you may read or hear. Cisgender refers to a person whose gender identity corresponds with the sex assigned to them at birth. Transgender is an umbrella term for people whose gender identity differs from the sex assigned to them at birth. So people are either cisgender or transgender. They could also be non-binary. So let's talk about this definition of non-binary, as it refers to gender identity. Non-binary is an identity embraced by some people who do not identify exclusively as men or women, boys or girls. A non-binary person may identify as being both a man and a woman, somewhere in between, or as falling completely outside these binary categories. Some related terms on this slide I'll hit really quick. Gender fluid, a person who does not identify with a single fixed gender or has a fluid or unfixed gender identity. So it's in flux, it's fluid. Finally, gender conforming and non-gender conforming. So this one is used mostly to refer to behaviors or forms of gender expression that conform or do not conform to masculine or feminine gender norms. So these terms are sometimes also used to describe gender identity, but they really refer to expression or behavior. If you think about it, gender conforming and non-gender conforming could also apply to language use or grammar usage. All right, so what are some of the issues relevant to conversations about gender and language? Well, societies and idea about gender have been evolving together for millennia, so gender has permeated many aspects of cultures, including language forms and language use. Our language reflects the cultural and societal norms that shape it, but language also influences how we think and how we act. In these lessons, when I say gendered language, I'm referring to uses of language that explicitly or implicitly rely upon or evoke associations with binary categories of sex or gender. So, male or female, masculine or feminine, men or women, as well as words or parts of words in which markers of binary gender categories, like grammar inflections, can actually be seen or heard. Obviously, the extent to which and the ways in which languages are gendered varies from culture to culture and from language to language. With regard to language use, grammatical gender or gendered language is relevant to at least three interrelated topics of concern: inclusive language, sexist language, and language that excludes non-binary persons. The first of these, inclusive or non-inclusive language, concerns how language forms, and especially the broader topic of language usage, account for or fail to account for a wide range of factors, including sex, gender, sexual orientation, race, physical ability, and age. This is indeed an important topic, but one that is beyond the scope of this limited video series, more focused on issues relating to the gender binary. For now, I'll just share the obvious. There are many excellent guides to inclusive language use in Spanish available online. Since we're on the topic, this is one great resource available from La Universidad del País Vasco. But again, setting aside the broad topic of inclusive language, in this video series, I want to focus more narrowly on two frequently discussed topics at the intersection of grammatical gender in Spanish and social or biological notions of gender and sex. Those would be language that is male-centric, in other words, defaulting to or favoring the masculine, and language that excludes non-binary persons in particular. So by sexism through language, I'm referring to the idea that certain language uses or even certain language forms uphold or reinforce accidentally or on purpose sexist conditions, attitudes, and behaviors. So it's that idea of male dominance, discrimination against women, the patriarchy, etc. Since feminism went mainstream in the 1970s or 1960s, depending on how progressive you are, many people, but mostly women, let's face it, have been pointing out that certain uses of language, not necessarily form-related, that have evolved over time, reflect and reinforce traditional sexist notions and attitudes. And some gendered language forms also reinforce or uphold sexist conditions or attitudes. You see me constantly making this distinction between the uses of language and the forms that are built into the languages that we use. In Spanish, they're both very relevant. Now, the goal of changes proposed to address these issues are, in fact, equality. The goal is equality, but generally it's a kind of equality that maintains the binary distinction between masculine and feminine, men and women. So people who are concerned about the male-centric bias of Spanish are searching for equality between the masculine and feminine aspects of the language. So it's still a binary distinction, but they're looking for equality in that binary. The second major concern we'll discuss relates to the exclusion of non-binary persons. Some non-binary individuals and allies feel that non-binary persons are excluded by the use of language forms in Spanish that reflect binary grammatical gender categories of masculine and feminine. The goals of changes proposed to address this concern include the intentional inclusion of non-binary persons, as well as the recognition and validation of their gender identities. In most cases, what is advocated for is not a complete degendering of Spanish. Rather, new forms are proposed for use when referring to or speaking about non-binary individuals, or in some cases, when referring to groups that may include people who do not identify exclusively as male or female. So at first glance, these issues may seem closely related, but the truth is they're actually quite different and imply very different kinds of solutions. People opposed to what they perceive as sexist language uses or forms are not necessarily advocating for changes that degender, so to speak, the Spanish language. Rather, they champion alternatives that challenge Spanish's traditional male-centric bias and convey a sense of gender equality, albeit binary gender equality. On the other hand, more and more non-binary folks and allies are advocating for the creation and use of non-binary or gender-neutral grammatical forms in Spanish. It should be noted that these are changes that many people opposed to sexism in language, including women, including feminists, and including trans men and women, may not embrace and may even oppose for a variety of reasons, most of which do not imply any hostility or intolerance whatsoever toward women or non-binary persons. So on the next couple of slides, I want to just illustrate with a few examples the fact that both English and Spanish have words, expressions, and even suffixes or other grammatical inflections that refer to concepts very closely tied to biological and societal notions of sex and gender. You can see from these examples that what we might call gender language in modern English typically consists of words or phrases. However, if you look closely at words like waitress, actress, and goddess, you may notice some common morphology too. As we'll see, grammatical indications of gender are much more common in Spanish. But it's also worth pointing out that in these examples and many others we could think of, it's fairly easy to detect a male-centric bias in gendered language, even in English. Look at forms like chairman. Sure, now we say chairwoman or chairperson, but for many, many years and decades we didn't. Manpower, the good guy. The fact that there are no sort of female-oriented, equivalents for these may say something about our culture. Look at the final examples, mistress and old maid. Again, the fact that it's hard to think of what would the male-phrased, so to speak, variants of these phrases be, says something about gender biases in our culture, I believe. All right, let's look at some similar sort of just kind of basic examples in Spanish. We can observe a similar male-centric bias in several cases, right? Look at the last one there, el secretario y la secretaria, right? What are the differences between el secretario masculine and la secretaria, right? Feminine or female. Think about it. El secretario might be a government minister, right? Whereas la secretaria may be what we think of a female administrative assistant nowadays. So there are those subtle or not so subtle, right, connections between language forms and our culture, our society. At the bottom of the screen, I'm calling attention to what is referred to as the generic or grammatical masculine in Spanish, which is the use of masculine forms to refer to groups that have at least one male, sometimes only one male, or when the gender makeup of the group is unknown. So, los pasajeros could be 99 women and 1 man. Los estudiantes, you could have 5 women and one guy. Or nosotros, right? Spanish would use the generic masculine or the masculino gramatical, right? In these cases. Now, this is interesting. Here's a tweet from the Real Academia Española, right? In which they make the case that basically the use of the generic masculine is a sufficient strategy for addressing all concerns relating to inclusive language. So, suffice it to say that many, many people would disagree, although some people would agree. So why does non-binary, gender-neutral, or gender-inclusive language seem to matter so much at this moment, right now, at this point in time? Why is this all of a sudden a thing? Well, basically, it has to do with the fact that a lot of people don't identify exclusively as men or women, boys or girls, and some identify as neither gender. That means they may feel excluded or alienated by language forms, language uses, but also language forms that assume and reinforce the binary categories of male and female, particularly when that language is used to talk about them or to refer to them. Continuing on about this why talk about this now point, right? The Linguistic Society of America, the LSA, describes this much better than I can in its statement against linguistic misgendering, and I'll go ahead and read that. Misgendering occurs when a person is called by a pronoun, title, or gender label that they, the referent, do not use or identify with, regardless of the intent. Using gender-inclusive and identity-affirming language is critical both to create an inclusive environment and to avoid misgendering people. Gender-inclusive language is language which does not impose external categories, such as a binary gender system, upon anyone who may not ascribe to that system. As the LSA also points out, linguistic misgendering goes beyond pronoun usage, which is something that's got a lot of coverage in the press. While pronouns are an obvious source of misgendering, it is also important to consider how misgendering can occur in other contexts. Languages with gender agreement, that genders the speaker, addressee, or third persons, should be treated similarly to any other gendering language, namely, using inappropriate gender agreement or morphology can constitute misgendering, and can disproportionately harm and alienate transgender, non-binary, and gender non-conforming people. Obviously, this point about gender agreement between language forms and the people talking, writing, or being referred to is particularly relevant to Spanish and other languages with markers of grammatical gender. Proponents of using gender-neutral or gender-inclusive forms to address non-binary individuals see this as a way to signal that we recognize their identities as valid and want to be inclusive when we use language. Okay, so I said at the outset that I wasn't here to share my own opinions about gender identity, but I do have a few closing thoughts on broader issues relating to gender and language usage. So stick around if you're interested, or feel free to jump straight to part 2, and where I focus more on those specific alternatives to binary forms. All right, so a question that often arises is, are binary language forms somehow inherently sexist or non-inclusive of non-binary persons? I personally don't think so. My approach is not to make language the bad guy or the bad person, but rather to focus on how people actually use language. What are they actually saying, and what is their intent in doing so? In my humble opinion, unless someone is purposefully trying to offend or exclude, it's best to assume no offense, to be patient, and to give the benefit of the doubt. Not everyone is at the same point in their journey toward inclusive language use, and there are some good reasons for that. Although some current language uses and forms may seem inadequate to some people, language change is an organic process that generally occurs at a very slow pace. Awareness, acceptance, and adoption of new ways of speaking and writing takes time, sometimes decades. In the meantime, lots of people are making good faith efforts to learn about and use alternatives to form that today may seem less than inclusive to some people. And maybe that's why you're here. So again, patience, grace, and the benefit of the doubt. Please avoid, resist any impulse to police the language of others. That's just never a good look. If you feel you must correct someone, my advice would be to do so with kindness, assuming the best of intentions, unless, of course, someone who should know better is offending folks on purpose. Back to the issue of the gender binary in Spanish grammar. While the markers of grammatical gender and the gender agreement patterns that have evolved as key features of Spanish are not necessarily problematic, it seems clear that they can and do in fact reflect and reinforce associations and even stereotypes about traditional gender roles. Of course, they often do not, and in many cases, grammatical gender, particularly when it comes to words for objects, is for all intents and purposes arbitrary. However, When binary language forms relate to persons, whether they be people we're talking or writing to or about, it's a good thing to have alternatives we can use to demonstrate that we acknowledge their identity and want to include them. Bottom line is, as a Spanish learner, a Spanish speaker, and especially as a Spanish teacher or instructor, I've come to realize that inclusive language is an extremely important topic to learn about. The fact is that many non-binary people and allies are calling for, proposing, and beginning to use alternatives to gendered language in order to be more inclusive. So whether or not you as a Spanish learner, Spanish speaker, or Spanish teacher fully embrace inclusive language, it's good to know what's going on so you can make your own informed decisions. All right. Thanks a lot for listening to a few of my thoughts from the soapbox. Since you're still here, I'll assume that you're also interested in learning about a few of the alternatives to binary forms in Spanish, the focus of part 2 in the series. But I hope that you found this introduction to the topic to be useful, informative, and even thought-provoking. If so, please join me for the next lesson. For now, thanks for watching y hasta pronto.